This is WNUT Talk on the WNUT Radio Network. You are listening to WNUT Talk here on the Live 365 Radio Network. And if you're not listening there, you're probably listening on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube or somewhere like that. I am Brandon, a.k.a. Stoney. And WNUT Talk is where I just, pick a topic and we kind of run with it. You come along while I will explore maybe the history of something, or I'll talk about a specific time, either in music history or, let's face it, a lot of times it's music because, hell, we're WNUT, we're a radio station, we deal with music a lot, but it could honestly be about any goddamn thing. I might decide to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger, my favorite movie someday. Who knows? It's WNUT Talk. I can talk about anything I want to. And today, I got a pretty interesting topic. I got something that I had never really thought about, and I would venture to guess a lot of people probably hadn't really thought about until I recently found a used book in a music store that got me thinking, got me reading, got me interested, and I'm going to talk about it here today and bring that before all of you as well, and see if it maybe gets your gears turning, see if you're interested. But either way, thank you for joining us here on WNUT Talk. Some of our most recent episodes, if you haven't gone back, oh my God, if you haven't been listening on Live 365, where this show runs weekdays at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., you can also go back and listen if you haven't been doing that. Recently, we did kind of not a history of the G-Funk era, but we talked about the beginnings of the G-Funk era, how it started, who planted the seeds, and how did that grow into the G-Funk era. But not only that, when it exploded on the scene in 1993 in Southern California there in the hip-hop scene, was it because of Dr. Dre? Or was it because of another producer in the area who had been orbiting around Eazy-E and Ruthless Records named Cold 187 of the group Above the Law? That was episode 6. Go back and check that out if you're interested in that topic. Also, just last week, the passing of Brian Wilson. One of the true, and I know this is an overused term in music when people are talking about somebody they look up to or respect or somebody whose music they love, but one of the honest-to-God true geniuses in rock and roll or popular music in the last century. Brian Wilson was a giant in what he did in songwriting and composing, in arranging, in harmony, just in all of it, man. And so we did an episode talking about him, reflecting on several aspects of his life, some of the things that he brought us, and even kind of touched on the feuds between him and his cousin Mike Love over the years, which you can't really talk about one without talking about the other, unfortunately. But hey, Brian Wilson left us with a lot of amazing stuff to listen to. I hope you've been immersing yourself in some of that great Beach Boys music this past week. Today, we're going to talk about something that is a little off of those beaten paths. Both of those deal with officially released music that, the artist makes and records, and then there's a record label somewhere, like in Dr. Dre's case, it was Death Row Records, later Aftermath, or in Brian Wilson's case, it was Capitol Records in the beginning, then it became Brother Records as they kind of owned their own shit. But that's not always the way that it happens in the music world. Sometimes the fans take it upon themselves to record a concert or find a rare tape and distribute that, press that up, make that available to people who wouldn't have otherwise heard it. I'm talking about bootleg records, bootleg CDs, bootleg tapes, the history of the bootleg record industry, which has always been something I've been fascinated with ever since I was a young kid. Before teenager, I would say probably 11 or 12, I first discovered bootleg records. And oh my God, ever since then, I've had them in my collection. I've had some in my collection that I would say are indispensable. Like if I were going to save, 50 records in a fire, in a house fire, and run out with my arms full of just a few CDs and records, man, there would be some in there that would not be officially released by any record label. There would be ones that the fans kind of took it upon themselves to press up and manufacture and make available to us. So the history of bootleg records is something that I had never really thought about. Like I said, they've always kind of been a part of my collecting since I was very young. Hell, sometimes you buy a bootleg, it's not very great. But sometimes you get one and you're like, holy shit, why aren't the labels making stuff like this available? We're going to get into that in a little bit. But, what I never had thought about was the fact that is essentially a shadow industry that has its own history. It had to start somewhere. It had to come from something. There had to be a group of people through the decades that kept it, evolving and morphing and changing. And there had to be a definitive kind of starting point and chapters in that story, and I had never considered it. And if you had asked me before, I would have just said, well, I mean, there's bootlegs. Somebody probably just started making some occasionally. They've just always kind of been there, but it wasn't until recently that concept really kind of was something I went, okay, I'm fascinated with this. I'm going to get into this. I'm going to learn more about it. And I did. If you have been listening to any of the WNUT programming that we do, besides WNUT Talk, obviously you're hearing this, right? But WNUT is a radio station / network. We're a broadcasting powerhouse, man. We put out multiple shows. It's not just WNUT Talk. We have the flagship show, WNUT, going all the way back to 1994. The great for Schniz, Carl, he has WNUT After Dark that you will hear on the Live 365 channel Friday nights at 10. You can also on demand any of these shows on our YouTube channel at The Real WNUT, not to mention the Jazzman and his WJAZ program. So we do a lot of great content that I hope you're listening to. I hope you're checking out there. But if you haven't been listening to the latest few episodes we did, on episode 42, we took a road trip to New England. We spent some time up in Connecticut checking out the music stores, talking to the people. We had Paul from Connecticut on the following episode 43. We did 2 episodes of the flagship WNUT show back to back from New England. And we talked about going to some record stores, including one in Orange, Connecticut called Merle's Record Rack. And when we were at Merle's, I was looking through the books on music and the autobiographies and the biographies of different musicians, and I found one that caught my eye, and it was not a bio. It was a book called Bootleg, The Secret History of the Other Recording Industry by a man named Clinton Halen. And this is a great book, published in 94, 95. It was originally published in Great Britain, brought over here to America. And I got to say, my interest was immediately piqued, and I picked this book up and I bought it. And I brought it home and started reading it not long after that. And I love the look of it. Let me just say first, the book is great. The pages are wider than a normal book. And so what you get is, like, in the center, there are margins that are kind of wider, blank margins toward the crease of the book, where they can put artwork for some of these bootlegs they're talking about. There's photos throughout the book, not on every page, but they're illustrating what they're talking about in the history of bootlegs. And it's a very cool read. It's about 400 pages. It's very comprehensive. I highly recommend it if this is something that you're interested in. Some of my information is going to be coming from that. I'm also going to be talking about some things that I have experienced bootlegs I have found and picked up over the years. So a great supplement. If you enjoy the episode you're about to hear, I recommend looking up Clinton Halen's Bootleg, The Secret History of the Other Recording Industry, which you're probably going to find used if you find it, but they have reissued a kind of a revised digital version, so you can download it to your e-reader, and that is available as well. So when we talk about bootlegs, basically the book picks up as far back as like Shakespeare. He goes all the way back to print. He talks about people who would literally transcribe plays that they were watching in shorthand, and they would publish this text in some way so that people could read and follow along with these stories without, being in the theater or going to see these plays. Not necessarily a theater, maybe on the hillside when Shakespeare would take his troupe and they would travel and do these things. So he goes all the way back to that. He talks about continuing through the years where people would bootleg things like serial story collections, eventually sheet music. So he gets into the music piracy there, people who were making illegal copies of the sheet music, as that was how you sold music in the time before it was recorded. And, you put it up on the piano and you played it or you sang it, and that was how music was distributed in the early days before recording was a thing, and then commercial distribution of such recordings. So yeah, we're not out there making our own tapes of things yet. We're not pressing copies of like a bootleg by The Who. Hey, side note, did you realize that in the early days of the 20th century, the mafia pretty much controlled everything, had an iron grip on anything that had a coin slot. If you could put a coin in it, cigarette machines, food vending machines, pinball machines, and slot machines especially, the mafia had an iron grip on that. And the reason was it was an easy way to launder money, because you could never prove how much had passed through them on a given day or in a given week or what have you. So if you controlled the coin slot machines, in a given area, you could launder all of your dirty money through that stuff as much as you wanted. It was basically a license to just make as much as you wanted in a way that you weren't supposed to, and then could explain it all away that way when called on the carpet to do that. And let me tell you what had a coin slot eventually: jukeboxes. Man, when jukeboxes became a big deal in the 50s, they came under the control of the mob in a big way, and the mob didn't like paying for records to distribute to all these jukeboxes. I mean, that's a negative cash flow. They like to keep their cash flow positive. So basically, they wound up with ways to press records, and they would knock off or counterfeit the popular records coming out, and then they would put those in 20 or 30,000 jukeboxes across America. And so the mob was out there counterfeiting, basically bootlegging, hit records for that purpose. Now, we'll get into the term bootleg very soon. I want to draw a distinction here before we get too far between bootlegging and piracy, but we're not there yet. So right now, just roll with me. Now, here is where we start to get into a little bit of the history of early bootlegging. Imagine people sitting in the audience at a jazz club, or maybe the club owner, or maybe people at a place where classical music or opera are being performed. This book specifically mentions the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City. And people would make recordings of some of this music and distribute that stuff as best they could. A lot of the early Charlie Parker stuff that we have is because someone in an audience or a club made these kinds of recordings and preserved that stuff at a time when really it was just thought that, okay, this person's going to this club and performing. It's just a moment in time. There's no reason to capture all of this stuff. You know, it was one thing if there were a label or a recording company who were trying to make some commercial recordings in a controlled studio environment, but people weren't thinking about preserving some of this live stuff that they were hearing. And then suddenly there became this kind of shadow industry of mostly just collectors. This was not bootlegging as you think of it today. These were collectors that really just wanted to preserve this stuff. For historic purposes, they wanted to curate their own libraries of some of this stuff. And that's really kind of as far as the appeal went. It was a very limited group of folks who were interested in this stuff. Now, did any of this cause a problem for the people making these types of recordings? Not by today's standards, but it could be a problem because, for example, the stuff that was being performed at the Metropolitan Opera House, Columbia Records had the mechanical rights. Mechanical rights refers to the right to put it on a medium like a record or a tape that can be sold or distributed to somebody. So they had the mechanical rights to any of those performances. And the ABC radio network would broadcast the stuff from the Met. So there were deals in place for people who wanted to be players in this game, and Columbia Records got an injunction against one group who were trying to preserve some of these radio broadcasts on record from the 1949 and 1950 season for that reason. So yeah, it could cause a problem, but it wasn't on the scale of what you might think of a couple of decades later when Rolling Stones bootlegs start flying around out there. So eventually, this kind of just hobby bootlegging would spread to stuff like movie soundtracks, which became a popular form of bootlegged record early on. Because at the time, labels just weren't trying to serve that market very well. It was not seen as an investment worth the time that they would be putting into it. And so people would bootleg movie soundtracks, basically just out of nostalgia. One bootlegger even got access to the version of the Annie Get Your Gun recordings that had Judy Garland singing the lead part, because Garland was originally cast in that film but was replaced during production, and her version of the songs had never been heard until these unofficial records kind of popped up on the market. So, little interesting footnotes like that would happen along the path in this fledgling bootleg industry before it became very focused on pop and rock music, and the wheels really got turning after that. But quickly, before we get there, before we move on into the rock and pop music, it's important to draw a distinction now between the term bootlegs, which basically refer to collections of recordings that the labels are not issuing. So Columbia Records, Warner Brothers, Capitol, those folks, they're not putting the stuff out. They have not issued this stuff previously. And it's stuff, because of that the public would not otherwise hear. So you got a bootlegger who's going, I can't get this in any form. It's on a tape here in front of me. I can make this available to people. And so he or she bootlegs it. That is versus piracy or counterfeit records, which are just copies of officially released records. You know, if you get Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, and then you learn that what you have is a knockoff version, maybe the cover doesn't look so hot, you know, the colors are wrong, or you know, the sound, when you put the sound in, it just sounds like you're hearing it through a tin can, and you realize that somebody has made a knockoff copy of that record. So you can get Dark Side of the Moon. You can go get that from Capitol Records, but you don't have a real one. You've got a counterfeit. That's not what we're talking about. When I say bootlegs, I'm not talking about counterfeits and knockoffs, though sometimes the twain do meet. We have records like, the first one that comes to mind is Metallica's Garage Days Revisited. They put an EP out in 1987 that had 5 songs on it. They sold this for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then it disappeared from the market. And so if you didn't get Garage Days Revisited by Metallica by about 1991 or so, you weren't going to get it. You weren't going to find them anymore because it wasn't out there. But the bootleggers could take those tracks and put them on collections that they would release that you could then buy on the bootleg market. And so, yeah, that's kind of a gray area. That stuff has been released by the label, but you can't get it anymore. And so the only way that you can get the stuff and you really, really want it as a collector, you really want it as a fan, and the label's not coming through for you, sometimes the bootleggers will. There's another famous one by Tori Amos, the first album she put out, Why Can't Tori Read? For the longest time, the only way you could get that album was a bootleg or a counterfeit, basically a pirated copy, and they had to put out guides for how to spot an original just because Atlantic Records was not going to put it back out, and Tori wasn't interested in having it back out there, so the bootleggers had to do what they do. Anyway, what was the first official rock bootleg in the history of bootlegs? We're going to get to that very soon here. Don't go away. We're coming right back on WNUT Talk.
Hey, what do we got here that goes with the most? I mean, I can't say my name, it's the B word and everything, but hey, I just want to say you're listening to WNUT. Hey, we really like it down here in the afterlife, you know what I'm saying? Oh my God, them guys are so funny. Anyway, listen, hey, I got to go, man. I just want to stop by and say, hey, you're listening to WNUT, so keep it up.
Best music, best talk. WNUT. You are back on WNUT Talk. What are we WNUT talking about today? Well, it is bootleg records, bootleg albums, bootleg music releases. Where'd they come from? How did that start? What was the history of it? Like I said in the last segment, I had never even really considered like the bootleg recording industry would have like a documented history, but sure enough, I mean, why wouldn't it? You know, it's just something that never occurred to me. So we're talking about the book Bootleg, The Secret History of the Other Recording Industry by Clinton Halen. And I had just asked the question before we went to commercial, what was the first rock bootleg? What was the first bootleg record that you would kind of think, you know, hey, this is the one that made an impact. This is outside of just people re-releasing classical music, you know, from radio broadcasts or recording Charlie Parker performing in a jazz club. Like, what was the first commercially successful rock bootleg? Well, in July 1969, a record started appearing in certain West Coast music stores that had a plain white sleeve and just a rubber stamp on it, you know, just ink from a rubber stamp that read Great White Wonder. And what Great White Wonder was a collection of Bob Dylan tracks that you couldn't get anywhere else, mostly outtakes from studio albums, a live TV performance when he had appeared on the Johnny Cash show, a demo that he'd recorded himself in a hotel room several years earlier, and unreleased material with the band recorded in 1967 that would not be officially released or see the light of day commercially until 1975, 6 years later, as the Basement Tapes. That's what people wanted, and this was the catalyst that finally got that material to be released by Columbia Records all those years later. So a little bit about where this came from and why this was a big deal. Dylan had been making some moves up to that point that frankly kind of pissed off his fans a little bit. First off, he had turned his back on his folk roots, going electric at the Newport Festival in 1965. If you don't know that story, it's a very famous one. Look it up. That one, man, he was basically the folk singer-songwriter hero. He had brought that scene to national attention just a few years earlier, and there he was, just turned his back on it, playing electric with his band. After his mysterious motorcycle accident the next year in 1966, he had famously gone reclusive for a while. And a lot of people didn't really know if the accident had happened. Speculation started that he was actually paralyzed from it. Maybe he'd been disfigured, or otherwise maybe he couldn't make music anymore. So he finally releases an album called John Wesley Harding, which time has looked back fondly on, but it failed to perform as well as his previous albums had up to then at that time. And as Vietnam escalated on into 1969, the album he chose to release right as everybody was turning to see what Bob Dylan might have to say was the country-flavored Nashville Skyline album, complete with a cheesy, affected Southern accent that he put on which he sang shit like, "Oh me, oh my, love that country pie." So Dylan fans were understandably a little underwhelmed by what he had been doing lately, but KPPC-FM in Los Angeles had gotten a hold of one of the publisher demos that Dylan had recorded with the band from this unreleased project, this unreleased album, a song called "This Wheel's on Fire." And they played the hell out of it. And suddenly, Rolling Stone was writing about this unreleased Bob Dylan album. The fans in the music world were speculating about these unheard songs. You know, what had happened? Why didn't we get those, but we're getting this stuff instead? So eventually, fans kind of followed the same chain that the DJs had followed, and they got a hold of the tapes. And Great White Wonder was born, along with the commercial bootleg record industry as we know it today. Other big titles that would follow in just the few years after that were fans got a hold of the Beatles tapes from an album that was going to be released. It was supposed to be called Get Back. The sessions actually predated Abbey Road. And the Beatles had been trying to replicate the laid-back sort of informality of their earlier work, especially Please Please Me. That was the album that had them. You're looking up the famous stairwell at Capitol Records, I think it was, or EMI, and there's the four Beatles looking down at you. They had taken a new photo of the Beatles posed in that same way, and they were visibly older. These would be the photos that you come to recognize from the two greatest hits albums, the red and blue covers. But they had taken that photo for an album called Get Back. And those sessions never quite yielded an album. They kept being talked about. Abbey Road came out. Finally, bootleggers got a hold of this stuff, tried to sequence the album as best they could, and release several versions of Get Back. And that forced the studio's hand to finally put out Let It Be. And Let It Be was kind of a sanitized version of what they had been trying to do originally. But hey, that wouldn't have happened, or at least it wouldn't have happened that way, without bootleggers forcing their hand with the Get Back project. Also, there was a legendary Rolling Stones concert released, which still to this day is heralded as one of the best ones the bootleggers ever got their hands on. There was a release called Liver Than You'll Ever Be, which was just basically bootleggers at a concert in Oakland, California, November 9th, 1969, with one Sennheiser microphone up above the audience's head pointed at the stage and capturing a hell of a show by the Rolling Stones in the early morning hours after midnight. Just incredible. And it's been reissued and reissued through the years many, many times. It's actually the thing that prompted Decca Records to put out the live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, to release an official live album, because fans had heard about Liver Than You'll Ever Be. They all wanted it. And to be honest with you, to this day, the reviews that you'll see online, the people in the know, Get Your Ya-Ya's Out does not live up to Liver Than You'll Ever Be. That is still a legendary recording in the bootlegging world. Okay, so what happens next, right? You got in the late 60s, early 70s, this starts happening. All these plain white covers with rubber stamps on them. Well, labels started popping up, kind of all operating outside of the law, as it were, but they were trying to distinguish their product for fans who wanted it. So you had these little kind of mom and pop labels, or, I'm using the word labels in kind of in quotation marks, because these are not official entities that are signing acts. These are basically people putting these labels out there to say, hey, if you liked this other one that I did, you'll maybe like this one too, or you're in good hands with me because I know how to do this well. I know how to, find good quality tapes and that kind of thing. So these labels start popping up in the early 70s. The main one was Trademark of Quality. Those were the guys who had originally been behind the Bob Dylan Great White Wonder. Bootleg. Trademark of Quality actually split into two labels by that same name when the original two partners went their separate ways. So you had two competing Trademark of Quality labels. You had Rubber Dubber, you had the Smokin' Pig, you had the amazing Corny Phone record label, Wizardo. All of these little bootleg labels started popping up and trying to find good tapes that they could release for acts that they knew the public wanted to hear stuff by, that they knew would sell. And again, most of this stuff was in just plain white sleeves for the longest time. The Trademark of Quality releases started to incorporate some artwork in like an insert that would go into the sleeve, but the outside still wasn't printed. And the artwork was done by a cartoonist named William Stout. And these original illustrations, you kind of have to think of them as like a pulp comic style meets Ralph Steadman, who used to illustrate for Hunter S. Thompson. So you kind of have that kind of a style going on. And so you have the white stamp covers because it's the only way to do this without losing money for a while. But eventually, Trademark of Quality started to incorporate the artwork that had been on those black and white inserts on the cover. They start printing these black and white covers. And eventually that kind of gave way to full color ones that also were, in a lot of instances, hand-drawn or illustrated, but finally began incorporating, photography and actual kind of graphic design and stuff like that. So you had a Canadian publication called Hot Wax, W-A-C-K-S, Hot Wax, little play on words there. This book and magazine series debuted in 1975. It began evaluating and cataloging the bootleg records that were out there for collectors, letting them know what the sound quality was like, letting them know what was on these things. It was the guide to collecting unofficial records and bootlegs. And you can still see their website today. You can still see the kind of work that they would do on there. And a lot of this stuff is available on sites like eBay or other places that might preserve, or you might say bootleg, some of that material. Now, of course, the industry responded. The recording industry tried tracking down who was making a lot of these records, which often was next to impossible because these people were not at like brick and mortar offices. There was nowhere to really go to follow a trail to the people responsible for these things. So the feds in the music industry would try threatening the stores that sold the stuff, but there wasn't much they could do there because these stores are also their bread and butter. You needed them to sell all the legit records that the industry's putting out, so you can't really do too much there. And what you'll see, the more that you kind of read about bootlegs that have come out through the years, or you read about some of maybe the lawsuits that have been brought against people who would bootleg, or you see some of those kind of, legal issues or some of those kinds of troubles that people would find themselves in throughout the years, you'll see that numbers were often greatly exaggerated, right? The music industry would kind of report that these bootleggers were selling just like tens or hundreds of thousands of copies of some of these bootleg records. And really, the truth was usually well under 10,000. The most common numbers that I've seen for massively popular bootlegs back in the vinyl days and on CD usually are in the few thousands per title. A popular release might get 1,500, might get 2,000 or 3,000 sales. A very popular one might do 5,000 or 6,000, and a huge monumental bootleg would do like 10,000 or 15. So you have to remember that buyers for this type of product worldwide have always numbered in the tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands or millions of people who want to buy this stuff. So if you're looking at 5,000 copies of a Bruce Springsteen bootleg from the 70s, like, live concert stuff that he would do, being sold, 5,000 copies of that versus 10 million copies of the official live release that Columbia Records puts out for Bruce Springsteen, then you see that more often than not, the feds in America or the British phonographic industry overseas, even when these folks, when the authorities in charge did do sting operations or raids, or they actually busted bootleggers throughout the years, what they would soon realize was there was never really any real meat on the bone for them to go after when it came to people making these things and selling them. Because the bootleggers were not getting rich off the numbers they were doing. They were getting things out to the public that they felt significant. Either musically, they wanted people to hear just a great performance, or historically, there was something that needed to be preserved, like Bob Dylan performing with the Hawks back in the day. So, a thing like that would not wind up being extremely profitable for the record industry. That's why they weren't pursuing this stuff. The record company knew, bootlegs were filling a hole in the record company's output. And they knew that like their strategy simply wouldn't have been profitable enough for them to go after releasing some of this stuff themselves. So Columbia Records wasn't going to release some of that stuff, but a bootlegger could. And they could sell just a few thousand copies, 3,000 to 5,000 of something that was pretty successful. Those were numbers that did not warrant a record label putting that release out. That would be considered a massive flop for the label, but a bootlegger could put that out. And it would fund, whatever recordings they were going to make next. The bootleggers were not getting rich. They were getting things out to the public. There were profits, sure, but you couldn't go out and buy a Ferrari on any of that stuff. You weren't going to retire on what you were making putting out bootleg records. You were going to fund the next release, maybe pay your bills. It was like any other job that you might take, So the big names in the 70s and well on into the 80s were your Dylans, your Led Zeppelins, the Stones, Pink Floyd, the Who, the Beatles to a lesser extent. They didn't really have a long touring history. They didn't have a lot of live material that you could go find tapes of. And they only recorded, X amount of stuff in the studio. So even scraping that barrel, you weren't going to get very far after you, found enough of it and put it out there. But anyway, bootleg recordings are actually what kept Bruce Springsteen in the public's mind as the live radio broadcast got issued as bootlegs during the years before and after Born to Run, when he wasn't putting anything out for a while. Springsteen was like radio silent for a bit there as far as releasing stuff went. But the bootleggers kept the appetite for his stuff alive and satiated, where he and the record label kind of weren't doing that. And so then the later that you go on into the 70s, you get to the punk scene. And bootlegs are basically the only reason there's any documentation at all of the early years of punk. You've got the Sex Pistols, who only put out one single with Glenn Matlock, but the bootleggers captured several shows with that lineup. Same with the Clash, or in New York, a band like Television, who were kind of the originators of the CBGB scene. The Buzzcocks, they only played a dozen shows with the original DeVoto and Shelley lineup before they split, and DeVoto went off and formed Magazine. But the bootleggers had all that stuff. So sometimes a band's peak would be over before most would-be fans ever even knew about it. I would say you can probably successfully argue that the influence of these bands and the impact of these original lineups live on because their music was bootlegged. So in that way, think about what I said about the history aspect of like a Dylan and the Hawks performance. The history of this stuff was captured because of these types of fans doing these types of things. And without them, there would just be stories. And maybe not even that. What was the biggest selling bootleg of all time, though? As we get on into the 80s, holy shit, one came out of left field that you probably wouldn't expect, and I'll talk about it right after this.
Full episodes at 6, noon, and 8. The best music mix all day. WNUT.
Hey man, this is the Jazz Man, and you are laid back listening to WNUT, you groovy cats.
We are back on WNUT Talk. WNUT talking about bootleg records today. The bootleg recording industry. How did it start? Was it the thorn in the music industry's side that they at times tried to make it out to be? How detrimental was it to these artists who, the bootleggers were just taking food out of their mouths and their families' mouths, right? No, there's nothing like that. There's never anything like that. In fact, like I've said before, hey, these bootlegs would sell in the 4 digits of numbers. On the low end, a moderately popular bootleg might do 1,500. A wildfire successful bootleg might do 10,000, might do 12,000. But usually, it's somewhere in the middle. Usually these things were selling 4,000 or 5,000. And just to the fans who knew where to look. Because as I said in the last segment here, the numbers of fans worldwide that were looking for this stuff numbered in the tens of thousands. There were not hundreds of thousands. There were not millions of fans buying this stuff or looking for this stuff. So, that the bootleggers were not taking the latest release by Led Zeppelin. They weren't taking Houses of the Holy and then running off their own 20,000 copies of Houses of the Holy and then go selling that. That is counterfeiting. That is not what we're talking about. That should be, searched out and stamped out. No, this is bootlegging. We're talking about people finding recordings of live performances. We're talking about people finding tapes of studio sessions that were never issued, or maybe something that had been issued in very limited numbers and that the public just couldn't get anymore. But there was still a market for that, and people were calling for, these releases that only were out there officially in very limited numbers and went away. And so, you could compile things like that together and put out a rarities bootleg. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. And on into the 80s and 90s, hey, that gave way to the CD age. The most bootlegged artists came to be Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, Nine Inch Nails. So, it was a changing of the guard. But well on into the 80s, the old guard was still very active. Bob Dylan, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Who, The Stones. They kept putting that stuff out for the longest time. It was like bootlegs were stuck in the first decade that they debuted, because there were a lot of ways that the bootleggers tried to get around the copyright issue. For a while, you could release performances that were more than 20 years old in certain countries where these bootlegs were being produced without any repercussions, and so the bootleggers tried to do that. Then they began trying to dance around the German and Italian copyright laws, which I've read extensively several chapters on those laws and how the bootleggers kind of straddled them creatively. I don't even fully understand it. There are a lot of ins and outs that the bootleggers exploited. And if you're interested, hey, get Clinton Halen's book, check it out. It's fascinating. It makes my eyes go crossed trying to figure it out. But eventually the floodgates just basically opened, and you started seeing things like bootlegs of the Woodstock, performances by your favorite artist just within the year since they had happened, released on, CD or double CD and stuff like that. So, hey, eventually the walls came tumbling down, and guess what? The recording industry did not die. The music industry did not blow away like dust in the wind. That wouldn't really happen until the streaming era. But anyway, what was the most popular bootleg of all time? I asked that right before the last commercial break. From what I've read, the consensus seems to be that the most popular, the highest selling bootleg ever released was a Prince release called The Black Album. In 1988, Prince recorded a set of 8 songs in the studio. This was set to be his next release after Sign of the Times. He had already pressed up promotional copies that had gone out. He ordered 500,000 of these things that had already been manufactured for sale to be pulled and destroyed, so they were. And about a week out from the album's release, he decided to scrap it. He decided to pull it from release, never officially put it out. He recycled one of the songs from it and paired it with a bunch of other ones that were not on the Black Album, and he put out the Love Sexy album instead. Well, the Black Album made its way to the bootleggers. And because, like I said, this stuff had never been issued by the record label, so it was fair game. Warner Brothers had never put it out. So the bootleggers could get away with it, and they did. And this thing sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. Now, reports that I see on Prince's website claim that on the bootleg market, it sold 200,000 copies. There is no way to know that. The only numbers we could track down if we wanted to were how many copies each, sort of bootleg label pressed up. Because once one issued it, another would copy it, another would copy it. They'd release their own versions of it. There's no way to really know. And if Prince's people are claiming 200,000, it's probably not that high. But it was a smash success. This is one of, if not the most popular bootlegs of all time. And you know what it did? It prompted Prince himself to finally release that album officially in 1994. Now, there wouldn't be a big to-do about it or anything. He really put it out as just a limited edition, plain black cover, no title. People still call it the Black Album, which is what they called it when it was released as a bootleg. But because of the bootleg market and because of what the bootleggers did, the world got an official release of this material. Prince understood how much people wanted it, how much people responded to it, how much people loved it. And he put it out there, and I've got a copy of it, the official one from Warner Brothers. It's great. I love it. It's not my favorite that he ever did, but I can see why a bootleg of this material would have been such a success, especially at that time in the 80s when there's an uncirculated Prince album and the bootleggers can scoop the record company and beat them to the punch. That's fucking power. So I mentioned earlier that I actually kind of came to know bootleg recordings when I was like 11 or 12. There was a record store that I still wish existed. Oh, so bad. I still wish I could shop this store again, called Radioactive Records at 8th and Broad Street in Augusta, Georgia. And this was one of the first places I ever saw like used records and CDs and tapes where you could get stuff that was out of print for a long time on the secondhand market. And this dude had bootleg CDs. He had unofficial recordings, which I had never seen before. And he not only had the CD versions of these bootlegs, but like he would actually dub these boots onto cassette with just like a Xerox J card with his handwritten track list for each bootleg and stuff. So if you didn't want to buy the CD, you could pick up the cassette dub of it for like $5 a pop. And I still have like 3 or 4 of those, which I think is a cool memento from this store in Augusta that I used to shop like 30 some years ago. So anyway, I was getting into Aerosmith at the time. I was really starting to collect and love Aerosmith when I was 12 or 13. And I bought an official copy on vinyl. It was used, but I bought Live Bootleg, which they put out in 1978. It was a live album called Live Bootleg, so it was done bootleg style. That was a thing for a minute. The bands got in on this craze themselves by putting out kind of low concept artwork official bootlegs. But anyway, so I bought that. And I remember seeing a CD on the shelf by Aerosmith called Live Bootleg Volume 2. And I was like, that's not a thing, is it? Did they put out a Live Bootleg Volume 2? No, they didn't. But he had it released in 1990 on Ironic Records. Apparently it was a reissue of something from the early 80s. I got Live Bootleg Volume 2. It wasn't the greatest quality thing in the world, but hey, I had Live Bootleg Volume 2 and none of my friends did, so that was pretty awesome. Also, I found something on vinyl that I've got right here still to this day. It was a release it wasn't released by Nirvana, but it's a Nirvana release called Wipeout. It has stickers on it that say made in the UK. And what this was early sessions for the Nevermind album. They had done these sessions. They weren't turning out quite the way they wanted them to, so they wound up scrapping them, and they would go back into the studio and make a proper run at doing Nevermind. And that's the version we all know and love. But this version, this is cool. And it's kind of cut with BBC sessions. They added BBC sessions to the track list to round it out. But this is a very cool release. That's probably that and Aerosmith's Live Bootleg are the first ones I ever bought, when I was about 12 years old. Still have them, still love them. One of my favorites of all time is an Aerosmith release called Spectacular Dream. And what that is a 2-disc set of their Woodstock 1994 performance. It's stamped Made in Luxembourg right on the front of the case. I still have that sticker here. And the label is called Dr. Gig. That's the only release I've ever seen on Dr. Gig. But the quality of this is immaculate. Oh my God, you would think Aerosmith put this thing out themselves. I love this bootleg. That is definitely one of my Desert Island bootlegs. I've also got bootlegs by folks like 9 Inch Nails, Primus. I got a couple of Pearl Jams. I actually got 3 Pearl Jams. I've even got the Gin Blossoms. The Gin Blossoms is probably not a, super bootlegged band. At least there's probably not a big market for them these days on bootleg. But I have it. It's one called In Bloom. Come on, man. The bootleggers literally just took a Nirvana song title and slapped it on the Gin Blossoms. But that's a bunch of live stuff on there, a couple of live sessions. I've got some great stuff by Guns N' Roses, which actually did pick up at Radioactive Records before they went out of business back in the 90s, including one that has a live performance from the American Music Awards with Guns N' Roses, the year that Don Henley filled in for them on drums. So I have a Guns N' Roses performance with Don Henley as a temporary member of the band, which is weird. And then at some point, I got into collecting the stuff from Woodstock by the bands that I really like the most. So like 9 Inch Nails, I've got one called Hellbound, and it's their Woodstock 1994 performance. Again, such good quality. Trent couldn't have done better if he put this album out himself on Nothing Records. It wouldn't have sounded better. Thing sounds spectacular. I've got some Pearl Jam ones, including an Atlanta show from 1994, and one called No Fucking Messiah, which was wildly popular for a bootleg in the early 90s. And No Fucking Messiah is significant because it actually has a version of them doing Sitting on the Dock of the Bay with Steve Cropper joining them on guitar, so that's pretty cool. And you want to know what my favorite little piece of bootleg ephemera is? Oh my God. I actually have a bootleg Bing Crosby record. Yes, I do, called Both Sides of Bing Crosby, featuring, unheard radio skits and things he would record for maybe like the Armed Forces networks. But then there's also a bunch of outtakes where he would be recording a song in the studio and he'd either forget the lyrics or he'd screw something up. So he would just start ad-libbing and cursing right there on a live mic. And some of this shit is so good. So yeah, I've got quite a bit of great stuff. In fact, I'm still picking this stuff up today. I went to my favorite local record store just this afternoon. I picked up a Def Leppard bootleg. It's a 2-disc set called The Circus Comes to Town from 1993 that I bet the Great Fish Sniz would be pretty fucking jealous of. But anyway, thank you for joining us for this episode of WNUT Talk. I am Brandon, a.k.a. Stoney. And if you like WNUT Talk, hey, you don't have to bootleg it. You can get it on your favorite podcast platform or network. You can also listen to WNUT on the Live 365 radio network at live365.com or just download the free Live 365 app. Search WNUT on either one of those and you'll be good to go. We will see you next time when the topic is Who the Hell Knows? Because I never do. I will see you then.